down. Scotland was better off by the tune of £4.9 billion in Barnett consequentials alone. Again, something the SNP voted against but will spend today. I encourage the Scottish Government to use that money to strengthen frontline services, bring down NHS waiting times and lift attainment in our schools. There are no more excuses. We ended austerity. It's time they followed.
Right, McNally.
Mr Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for that answer. A thriving retail, hospitality and leisure sector is critical to brand Scotland. Following the welcome decision in the budget to ensure 40% rates relief for RHL businesses in England, what guarantees, if any, has my right honourable friend had from the Scottish Government that the extra Barnett consequentials linked to non-domestic rates will be passed on at today's Scottish budget? And does he agree with me that any failure to do so would be deeply damaging to the sector?
Thank you to my honourable friend for that question. He is absolutely correct. The UK budget shows investment over decline, including investment directly in my honourable friend's constituency as part of the £200 million Towns Fund, as well as the biggest budget settlement in the history of devolution. He's also right that our hospitality businesses in particular need this rates relief more than ever. The Scottish Government should be using that budget to deliver growth and investment to help our high streets, and passing on these reliefs should be the bare minimum from the Scottish Government.
Irene Campbell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We have delivered the biggest budget settlement to the Scottish Government in the history of devolution, with more than £4.9 billion, as you've heard today, of extra funding that can go to public services. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that there are no more excuses for the SNP and that Scots expect and deserve delivery and improvement to our public services?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Of course, I couldn't agree more. It's not just the £4.9 billion in Barnett consequentials, but all the other investment the UK Government made outside those Barnett consequentials. The Labour Government has delivered billions of pounds more for schools and hospitals in Scotland. Mr Speaker, it's more money than ever before, but the SNP MPs voted against it. They voted to deny Holyrood its biggest ever budget settlement by voting against the Finance Bill last week, but of course they will happily spend it in their budget today. They also voted against GB Energy in the SNP leader's own constituency. Given what we've read about the SNP's selection processes, I guess the SNP MPs seem keener to send themselves to Holyrood than billions of pounds of extra funding.
Brendan O'Hara.
Speaker, I'm sure the pensioners in the Secretary of State's constituency are as relieved as those in Argyll, Bute and South Lochaber that the Scottish Government's budget will introduce a pension age winter heating payment for all Scottish pensioners. The SNP Government is doing the right thing by Scottish pensioners. So will he join me in urging the Labour Government here at Westminster to also do the right thing by the pensioners of England and Wales and give back to them their winter fuel allowance as well?
Mr Speaker, what the honourable gentleman has just proved is the winter fuel payment in Scotland is actually devolved.
The consequences of the budget was to remove £5 million of regeneration funding for Perth city centre. We got practically nothing from their levelling up fund, save this paltry £5 million that he is even taking away. Just what is it that UK Government has against the city of Perth?
Mr Speaker, no projects have been cancelled. The Perth deal is being under consideration by MHCLG and the Treasury. It hasn't been cancelled, it has been merely paused. But what I would say is that the honourable gentleman should speak to his colleagues in the Scottish Government, who have got £4.9 billion extra in Barnett consequentials to spend today, and perhaps he could even have a chat with some of his colleagues sitting next to him who seem happier in Holyrood than they are here.
Seamus Logan.
Question number 7, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I know there is consensus right across this House on the enormous value of the hospice sector and the extraordinary work that they do, work which has been sadly undervalued for far too long. Support for the additional employer national insurance contributions will be allocated to departments, with the Barnett formula applying in the usual way for devolved governments. The rise does not begin until April, and we'll set out further details on the allocation of funding in due course.
Thank you. Good night. Seamus Logan.
Oh, Seamus! Very popular.
Mr Speaker, there are 45 hospices in Scotland. I can't be certain of that figure because so many of them are in dire financial circumstances. I think of Roxburgh House in Aberdeen, which provides services to my constituents and to other MPs in this Chamber's constituents. Another organisation that provides vital hospice care is the Marie Curie charity, which provides services in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and they also provide hospice at home care They are facing a bill close to £3 million as a result of decisions by this government. So what does the Minister have to say in relation to help that can be provided to Marie Curie and other organisations?
Good question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the honourable gentleman will know, the pressures on hospice funding long predate the budget and relate to declining real terms funding from the Scottish Government. I note that nearly 5,000 members of the public have written to the Scottish Government recently to support calls from the Scottish Hospice Leadership Group for fair funding. Those calls might be answered this afternoon, where the SNP Government has to spend an extra £5 billion, secured by Scottish Labour MPs, voted against by SNP MPs and spent this afternoon by SNP ministers. Make it make sense.
Right, we now come to Prime Minister's questions. In room.
Question number 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Order. What are these two members playing at? That is absolutely disgraceful for the member. We've started PMQs. Either come in early or at least wait. Please start reading the room. In room.
Question number 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to welcome His Highness the Emir of the State of Qatar to the UK, and I look forward to discussions this afternoon on how we're strengthening our relationship and boosting trade and investment, including the announcement today of a £1 billion investment in our new clean energy partnership. Mr. Speaker, Sunday marked World AIDS Day, and we stand with all those that we have lost and those living with HIV today, and we will seek to end new cases of HIV in England by 2030. Mr. Speaker, can I also note that we're joined in the gallery today by Mandy Damari, mother of Emily, a British citizen still being held hostage in Gaza. I've met Mandy a number of times, and in my view, what she's going through is nothing short of torture. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
In room.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to concur with the comments the Prime Minister has just made. North Devon District Hospital is the most remotest hospital in mainland England. Its intensive care unit has only 6 beds and it's almost 50 years old and it serves a population of 165,000 people. Can the Prime Minister assure my constituents that their hospital will receive the urgent funding that it's needed to under the new hospital programme so that they will not face over a 2-hour drive to the nearest trauma unit?
Mr. Speaker, the new hospital programme that we inherited was emblematic of the failures of the previous government, making promises with no plan to deliver on them. We are committed to delivery, including the North Devon Hospital. We're reviewing the programme to place it on a sustainable footing, and the Health Secretary will set out further details of the new delivery soon. And in the meantime, we continue to support trusts to develop their schemes. Thank you.
Olivia Bailey.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the swift and decisive action this government is taking to secure our borders after the party opposite lost control. After the party opposite lost control, Mr. Speaker. And in particular, can I welcome the world-first deal struck with Iraq last week to tackle smuggling gangs? Does the Prime Minister agree with me that international cooperation, shared intelligence and joint law enforcement is the best way to end the vile smuggling trade?
I thank my honourable friend. She's a superb champion for her constituents. And she's absolutely right. The previous government left a broken asylum system. We put a plan in place, the Border Security Command, backed by £150 million, 100 more NCA officers, and we're introducing counter-terrorist style powers. And my friend is right that our new international coordination, including the landmark Iraqi agreement. And the hard graft is already beginning to pay off, because 9,400 people who've no right to be here have been returned. That's a 30% increase on the numbers of last year. They promised to get the flights off the ground. We've got them off the ground.
We come to the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Berlo.
Mr. Speaker, if I may, I would like to pay tribute to Mandy Damari and her family for the strength that they have shown. And we on this side of the House, and I'm sure the whole House, continue to seek the speedy release of Emily Damari and the other hostages. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister talks about immigration. I think it's probably a good time to remind him that he was the one writing letters asking us not to deport foreign criminals. And he and his party voted against every single measure that we put in place to try and limit immigration. But, Mr. Speaker, the question today is what has been on the lips of all Labour MPs, including, I believe, the Health Secretary yesterday. The Prime Minister knowingly appointed a convicted fraudster to be his Transport Secretary. What was he thinking?
Mr. Speaker, the previous Transport Secretary was right when further information came forward to resign. What a marked contrast to behaviour in the last 14 years. And she talks about immigration, record levels of immigration under the previous government, nearly 1 million. And she was the cheerleader. She was the one urging on the removal of the caps for work visas. She was thanking the previous Home Secretary for the work that was done. She championed it. She advocated it. Record numbers of immigration.
Mr. Speaker, he's obfuscating, but I'm going to keep him on the topic. He owes the House an explanation. He said that the former Transport Secretary was only asked to resign after further information came to light. What was that further information?
I'm not going to disclose private conversations. Further information came to light. The Justice Secretary resigned. As I say, what a marked contrast. Whilst she's obsessing with the Westminster issues, we're getting on with fixing the mess, fixing the foundations, that £22 billion black hole, our prisons bursting, Mr. Speaker, as we found out last week, nearly 1 million net migration numbers because of the Tory open borders policy.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not asking about migration. I'm asking about the former Transport Secretary. He never answers any questions. He never answers any questions. And it looks like he didn't ask his Transport Secretary any questions either. The truth is, he appointed a person convicted of fraud to the Cabinet. The first thing she did was bung hundreds of millions of pounds in pay rises to her trade union friends. Wasn't this a fraud on the British people?
No, Mr. Speaker, she says she's not talking about immigration. I'm not surprised. And I advise her and all of them not to talk about the economy or immigration for another 5 years.
Mr. Speaker, he can try and change the topic as much as he likes, but the public are watching. He owes them an explanation. The country needs conviction politicians, not politicians with convictions. Now on to an even bigger fraud. Yes. Now on to an even bigger fraud, the budget. Last week, the Prime Minister failed to repeat the Chancellor's pledge of no more borrowing and no more taxes. It is obvious that they are coming back for more. In his manifesto, he committed to making Britain the fastest-growing economy in the G7. Does he stand by his own pledge?
Mr. Speaker, I gently remind her that 2 of her predecessors had convictions for breaking the COVID rules. I'd also invite her to look at the OECD report of this morning, which has upgraded growth for next year and the year after, which now puts us on target to be the highest growing major economy in Europe in the next 2 years. She should welcome that.
Mr. Speaker, I saw the OECD report, and what it said was that they will be coming back for more taxes. And I think the whole House would have heard him fail to repeat his own pledge. He can't even repeat the pledges that he made just a few weeks ago. We are here to stop him from damaging the economy, and that is why we are
I want to hear the question. Can we bear up?
Mr. Speaker, they are laughing the same way they all laughed during the budget when they talked about raising NI. They have no idea what people out there are dealing with. And that is why yesterday we voted against his damaging jobs tax. Even former supporters, Chef Tom Carriage, who endorsed Labour at the election, said that the budget was catastrophic. He built a real business employing young people, unlike his cabinet of trade union stooges, CV embellishers, and an actual fraudster. None of them have ever run a business. Why won't he listen to business who are saying his budget is catastrophic?
Mr. Speaker, I thought the scripted jokes were over, but we had another one about lectures about the economy from the party opposite. They broke the economy, mortgages through the roof, and a £22 billion black hole. And she talks about national insurance. She complains about the rise in national insurance week after week. But then 2 weeks ago, she says that she wouldn't reverse it. She signed trade deals, Mr. Speaker, that had farmers protesting in Whitehall. Now she pretends that she's their champion. She campaigned to remove the cap on migrant worker visas, and now she pretends she's furious about the open borders policy of the last government.
Mr. Speaker, the fact is the Prime Minister has discarded his own Labour leadership promises. He's dropped the 5 missions he said would define his government. He's ditched his pledge to make Britain the fastest-growing economy in the G7. We left office with UK the fastest-growing economy in the G7. And business is saying he has damaged the economy with his budget. Tomorrow he's going to have an emergency reset, Mr. Speaker, just 5 months into his premiership. But why should anyone believe a word he says?
Mr. Speaker, the only relaunch on that side of the House is the leadership bids of her rivals. And they should she obviously hasn't read the OECD report of this morning, the fastest growth in the next 2 years of any major economy in Europe. We're proud of that. And they should never be allowed to forget the damage they did to our country. They used Britain like some sort of mad scientist experiment. Open borders, unfunded tax cuts, neglected health service. And now, all the madness is still coming out. They say they should be back in office. They haven't listened, they haven't learned, and they certainly haven't changed. There's only one party that's driving this country forward, and that's this Labour government.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, question 3, but who knows, next week I could be #1 in the charts. As the first MP this year to bring out a Christmas single, will the Prime Minister join me in thanking my musical collaborator, the hugely talented Mal Pope, and everyone involved with this year's Everyone Deserves hamper campaign that would deliver festive food to 1,500 homes across 5 constituencies in South Wales. Like our song says, there's a reason for the season, and everyone deserves a Christmas.
Well, I thank her for her question. There's obviously going to be some rivalry in the race for #1 by Christmas. I'm not going to be joining in that particular one. But I do thank her and Mal Pope for their campaigning. And I remember joining her in the summer, a few summers ago, on the work involving hampers, much needed by her constituents. And I know how much it means to them. Christmas is a time to think of others. And I do pay tribute to her and all those supporting those in need. And this government will always support the most vulnerable in our society. Thank you.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mrs Deputy Speaker. I, for one, will be downloading the song of the Honourable Lady for Neath and Swansea East. Can I join the Prime Minister in his delight and also his support for Mani Damari, and I'll join hope that we will see Emily and other hostages released as soon as possible. Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister has rightly spoken about the need to restore and rebuild the public's trust in British politics. Now, we believe a crucial part of that is reforming our electoral system to make it fairer and more proportional. And so does a majority of the British public. And this House voted yesterday in favour of a bill for electoral reform put forward by my honourable friend, the member for Richmond Park. So will the Prime Minister find government time, make it available, so we can consider this bill on electoral reform and restore the public's trust in our politics?
Can I thank him for referencing Emily, because I think it is important that we all remember her, and I say the awful torture that her mother is going through, and that's the case for all of the other hostages. It's hard to imagine what it must be like for anybody with friends and family who are still being held hostage after all this time. Look, proportional representation is not our policy. We won't be making time for it. And I just gently say to him, he didn't do too badly under the system as it is.
Right, David. Well, I'm disappointed in that reply and hope he will reflect on Labour's own policy. But moving on to another pressing subject, Mr. Speaker, more than 3 million people have been stuck on NHS waiting lists for more than 18 weeks. That's probably the worst, most appalling legacy of the last Conservative government, and it needs to be fixed. But does the Prime Minister accept that we'll only get waiting lists down and keep them down if it's easier for everyone to see a GP when they need it? So when he publishes his milestones tomorrow, will he include a guarantee with a timetable so people will be able to see a GP within at least 7 days or 24 hours if it's urgent?
Yeah. Well, he's right to draw attention to the record of last government on the NHS. Record waiting lists and record low confidence in the NHS. So in addition to the economy and immigration, they better not be talking about that for the next 5 years either. We will be driving this down. We've already begun that work to make sure we get those waiting lists down. And yes, of course, that does also include making sure there's better access to GPs and other measures that need to be taken. But that's a central driving mission of this government. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that a significant number of members in this place are, regardless of class, women of a certain age, would the Prime Minister agree with me that when a woman of a certain age, or indeed any woman of any age from any background, says they have experienced sexual harassment or inappropriate behaviour, they should be listened to, supported and the perpetrator dealt with?
I certainly agree with that, and I think everybody across the House would. She's right, because, Mr. Speaker, one of the greatest barriers that women face when coming forward and reporting unacceptable behaviour in the workplace is having confidence that they will be taken seriously, and that requires all of us to put in place mechanisms and arrangements to make that possible. Everybody should be treated with dignity and respect, and I'm proud of the fact that the Employment Rights Bill that we're passing will strengthen protections from sexual harassment at work.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Friday the 13th is a date associated with bad things happening. Next Friday, the European Union's General Product Safety Regulations will apply in Northern Ireland, creating more costs and bureaucracy for English, Scottish and Welsh companies who want to do business in Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland consumers buying from them. Many businesses have already stopped supplying Northern Ireland. Haulage companies are unsure what is required of them. Online sales platforms are divided on the advice that they give. Mr. Speaker, a previous Prime Minister promised Northern Ireland businesses that if they were asked to complete additional paperwork, they should phone the Prime Minister and he would direct them to throw the form in the bin. What direct, tangible advice can the Prime Minister give to those businesses who want to continue supplying Northern Ireland?
Well, I thank him for that question. It is a serious issue, and the government is working closely with businesses to ensure that they are ready for the changes that he has identified, and we published more guidance, as he knows, yesterday to support them further. We will be keeping a close eye on the issue to help businesses trade freely across the whole of the United Kingdom. Thank you.
David Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Stoke-on-Trent and Kidsgrove, we are proud of our beautiful historic buildings. However, many lay dormant and blight our proud towns. Can the Prime Minister please outline what steps this government is taking to bring historic buildings back into use And will he make time to visit my constituency to see for himself our untapped potential?
Well, I thank him for raising this issue and certainly consider his kind invitation. Mr. Speaker, we will invest in heritage buildings, restoring pride and ensuring they serve the needs of local communities. The National Lottery Heritage Fund has awarded Stoke-on-Trent £250,000 to help preserve the city's heritage. Historic England is also funding emergency repairs at the iconic Wedgwood Institute and supporting Reform Heritage, whose office, I think, is based in my honourable friend's constituency, to employ staff dedicated to delivering heritage projects.
Pete Wishart.
Speaker, today is the Scottish Budget, and inside it you will find provisions to reinstate the winter fuel payment to all of Scottish pensioners, something that he, of course, famously took away from nearly all of the UK pensioners, supported by Scottish Labour members of Parliament. But apparently, Scottish Labour are now in favour of winter fuel payments. So what's his advice to Labour MSPs? Is it to vote for the budget to ensure that Scottish pensioners get that single fuel payment, or is it to stick with his view and vote that budget down?
My advice to my team is to ensure the SNP are absolutely clear. We have given them the biggest settlement to Scotland this year under our budget. They now have the powers, they have the resources, they've got no more excuses for the failure to deliver.
Clive Efford.
Speaker, a year ago today, this House defeated the then government over the contaminated blood scandal compensation scheme. This government's £11.8 billion set aside for that compensation scheme is welcome. But as victims die every week, there is concern about the pace of payments and the fact that rules are being changed behind closed doors in Whitehall without explanation, contradicting some of the recommendations of Sir Brian Langstaff. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that next week's meeting scheduled with the campaign groups representing the victims must represent the start of those infected and affected being involved in the process that they fought so hard for so long and too many died and failed to see?
Mr. Speaker, we are committed to acting on the findings of the infected blood inquiry and ensuring swift resolution and compensating in full. And that's why we announced £11.8 billion to compensate those who waited far too long for justice. And I'll happily make sure that he gets a meeting with the Paymaster General to discuss the issues he's raised.
Adam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every day, pensioners in my Leicester South constituency are emailing me with one word, and that word is frightened. Susan, who has pulmonary fibrosis, wrote, "During winter, I rarely go out as it is too cold for my lungs. I need to keep warm and I need to keep my heating on. The winter fuel payment was really helpful." She writes, "I want MPs to know that not all pensioners are millionaires or receive gifts from millionaires, nor do we all get the higher rate of pension. Susan is frightened she won't be able to keep her house warm this winter, and she is not alone. Does the Prime Minister realise how frightening it is for the 8,100 pensioners in my constituency who have lost their winter fuel payment fuel payment help? As the winter month starts to bite, will the Prime Minister come to Leicester to explain to Susan why he thinks this policy is not frightening?" Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, as he knows, the number one job of this government was to get our finances back in order after the mess that the last government made, including leaving a £22 billion black hole. We had to take tough choices. They say they want the benefits, but they can't say how they're going to pay for them. We do want to make sure that the most vulnerable pensioners do get the pension credit that they're entitled to. We're driving that up. But because we're stabilising the economy, we can commit to the triple lock. That's a £460 uplift in the pension next year. So every pensioner will be better off under a Labour government.
Andrew Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Middlewich Eastern Bypass will support the delivery of nearly 2,000 new homes, 6,500 jobs and 1.5 million square feet of employment land. The previous government, having first promised to fund it, dragged their feet, putting jobs and investment at risk. Mr. Speaker, we're approaching the season of goodwill. So can the Prime Minister give my constituents an early Christmas present and offer some certainty over this vital infrastructure project?
Mr. Speaker, we are committed to supporting drivers across the country, including by freezing fuel duty and investing £1.6 billion to maintain our roads. That's £500 million more than the previous year. I do know his constituents have waited years for certainty on this scheme. The project is currently going through an assessment and government process, and I'll make sure that he gets a meeting with the Roads Minister to discuss that.
Martin Wrigley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The major GP practice groups in my Newton Abbot constituency have written to me detailing their precarious finances. Planning for the year ahead, they're considering their options, including redundancies, handing back their contracts or bankruptcy, and they've stopped recruitment of GPs, resulting in fewer patient appointments. The Health Secretary has promised an increased funding allocation, but has yet to say when we will know how much this will be. Will the Prime Minister release this funding information and meet with me and the GPs to hear their precious first-hand?
Mr. Speaker, he's right to raise this. The Darzi report that we commissioned made clear that the NHS was broken by the previous government, and that's why we provided £22 billion of additional funding in the budget this year to start the work fixing our NHS. We do obviously value the vital work of GPs, and every year, as he knows, we consult with the sector about the services that they provide and the money they're entitled to in return. And we'll send that out. We will set that out in the usual way.
Thanks, McIntyre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Holly Gazzard was murdered by her boyfriend outside her workplace in Gloucester 10 years ago. Since then, her family have established the Holly Gazzard Trust, which educates young people on domestic abuse and stalking and keeps women safe with its Hollyguard app. Will the Prime Minister join me in paying tribute to Holly's family and the work of the Holly Gazzard Trust? And will he update the House on the steps that this government is taking to tackle violence against women and girls?
Mr. Speaker, a decade on, the thoughts, I'm sure, of the whole House remain with Holly's family and friends, and I do join him in commending the vital work of the Holly Gazzard Trust. In relation to the steps we're taking, we've got a mission to halve the levels of violence against women and girls within a decade. That is really tough to do. Nobody has ever committed to that before. I invite everybody across the House to join us in that. And that will include, amongst the steps we're taking, placing domestic abuse experts in 999 control rooms to make sure they're picked up early, launching a pilot of new domestic abuse protection orders, developing a national framework to track and target high-harm offenders, and strengthening stalking prevention orders. We will take other measures to make good on this commitment.
Graham Leadbitter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A WASPy woman dies every 13 minutes. That's 2 since the Prime Minister took to the dispatch box today. That's 111 every day and nearly 17,000 since he took office. So can I ask the Prime Minister, how many more WASPy women have to die before the government takes action to give them the financial redress and the justice that they are due?
Mr. Speaker, we are moving at pace on all relevant issues. We've passed the budget to provide the baseline for what we need, and will continue to do so.
Yuan Yang.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Local councils in my constituency of Earley and Woodley are facing significant financial pressures from SEND provision. Woking Borough, for example, has twice the level of SEND instance than the national average, yet historically the level of funding has not met the level of need, and this has left families and children waiting too long for help. The previous government's safety valve programme was only a sticking plaster, so I welcome this government's announcement today of additional SEND funding in mainstream schools. What more can this government do to make SEND funding sustainable?
I'm grateful to her for raising this. I think the 5th or 6th time SEND has been raised at PMQs. We did inherit a system neglected to the point of crisis by the last government, and so we'll deliver the change that's desperately needed. That means increased funding to the core schools budget by £2.3 billion, includes almost £1 billion more on high needs budgets. And today we're investing and announcing the investment of £740 million in funding to create SEN units in mainstream schools which deliver specialist support, and I'm very pleased to be able to take that forward.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, members across this House are deeply concerned that the Post Office are considering closing more than 100 branches across our communities. More than 3,000 people have signed a petition opposing the closure of Bexhill Post Office. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the government must ensure we protect vital post office services for all of our constituents?
Can I thank him for his question, and can I also recognise the campaigning of many, including himself, for local services that their constituents rely on. The Post Office is required to maintain a network of 11,500 branches and ensure that 99% of the UK population lives within 3 miles of a post office. Decisions, obviously, about individual branches are for the Post Office to take, following consultation with local communities, but I'm happy to make sure he gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss his particular case.
Speaker, in my constituency of Darlington, it's full steam ahead to 2025, when our town celebrate the 200-year anniversary of the railways with a 9-month festival. We're proud of our industrial contribution, but many in my area have concerns about the future of our rail industry. What assurances can the PM offer that he will get our railways back on track?
Mr. Speaker, we are delivering on our commitment to bring railways back under public ownership, putting passengers first. And today we've announced that South Western Railway services will be the first to transfer into public ownership next year. So we can turn the page on decades of delay, fragmentation and failure.
Kirsty Blackman.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Veteran Anne Puckridge is also in the gallery, and can I urge the Prime Minister to meet her to talk about her frozen pension? Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Daily Record reported that Scottish Labour MPs are very upset. Apparently this upset is caused by their Scottish leaders' diktat that they now have to support the very winter fuel payment that they voted against in this place. As the Prime Minister comforts his upset MPs, will he remind him that the only people with the right to be upset are the 900,000 Scottish pensioners who were left in the cold by Labour's cuts?
I work very closely with Scottish Labour in a harmonious way. We ran a fantastic campaign earlier this year, which is why she's sitting up there and not down here.
Leon Conlon.
Can I echo the words across the House in relation to Mandy Damari, who I also met with this week and is from Beckenham? Yesterday marked International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and I'm proud to be one of the disabled MPs in this House. As a sixth former, I became one of the youngest people in Britain to have a hip replacement, and I relied on a blue badge. Data released yesterday shows blue badge theft has more than quadrupled in the past 10 years. Will the Prime Minister back my campaign to tackle blue badge theft and ensure millions of disabled people can work, socialise and live an independent life?
Can I thank him for being a powerful voice for some of the most vulnerable in our society? Look, theft of a blue badge is appalling, depriving people of their independence and ability to travel with confidence. It has a real human impact every single time, and that's why we're working closely with local authorities to help them tackle fraud and misuse. And I'll make sure he has a meeting with the relevant minister to examine what more can be done.
Chris Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on from the question from the member for Aberdeen North, in the gallery today is Anne Puckridge, who is a World War II veteran and an intense campaigner. She's flown over 5,000 miles from Canada to meet the Prime Minister to discuss the frozen pensions, a policy denying her and 500,000 Brits who live abroad a frozen pension. I'm sure Anne won't mind me saying that she will be 100 years old in a couple of days' time. Would the Prime Minister reconsider his decision, give Anne the best birthday present ever, and meet with her to discuss this issue?
Well, I'm grateful to him for raising this issue. I think he will well know and understand that our position is, in fact, a continuation of the position under the last government.
Richard Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister share my concern at the report by Audit Scotland, finding the Scottish Government has no clear plan for the NHS in Scotland? As a Scottish Labour MP, I'm delighted this Government is providing £4.9 billion extra for public services in Scotland. Isn't it time for the SNP ministers to get a grip and do better for patients in my constituency who are facing some of the longest waiting times for surgery in Scotland?
Well, I'm grateful to him for raising this because waiting lists in Scotland are appalling. And that's why we make the argument. They now have the money, they've got the resources, no more excuses for poor delivery.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. Point of order, Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to seek your advice on yesterday's debate that was a jobs tax on working people that aren't working people, or it depends on what the definition of working people is. The Exchequer Secretary claimed that the OBR stated there was a cover-up by the previous government. Today, on page 204 of Hansard, are the words used by the Minister where he said that the OBR used the word cover-up not once, but twice. I have since checked with the OBR. They have not said this, and I believe it is a creative use of words to suit a political narrative. Could the Speaker advise me on how I could bring the Minister to the House to correct the record?
The front bench want to, or I'll deal with it now. OK. Look, first of all, I'm grateful for the member giving notice of point of order. I understand he has notified the honourable member for Ealing North that he intended to refer to the matter in the chamber. Thank you for doing that. The Chair is not responsible for what ministers say in the chamber, and this has been historic. But he certainly has put the record straight, in his view, and I'm sure that the Treasury bench will have noted his remarks and therefore will reflect on it. Let me put it at that stage. Right. We now come to the 10-minute rule bill. Preet Kaur.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to provide that where a public body collects data about ethnicity for the purpose of delivering public services, it must include specific Sikh and Jewish categories as options for a person's ethnic group and for connected purposes. Jews and Sikhs are in the unique position of being considered both ethnic and religious groups under the Equality Act 2010. Sikhs and Jews have been legally recognised as ethnic groups for over 40 years since the Mandela v Dowley case in 1983. The bill would address a fundamental absurdity in the fight against discrimination and inequality that we do not collect ethnicity data on Sikhs and Jews since laws on racial discrimination were first introduced nearly 60 years ago. The Women and Equality Select Committee were told in February 2018 that the government's race disparity audit had identified around 340 data sets across government but found no data on Sikhs. The only data collected on Sikhs and Jews in more recent years is religious data. However, the quality of data collected by public bodies on religion compared to ethnicity is poor, patchy and incomplete. Religion data is never used by public bodies to make decisions for the purposes of delivering public services. It makes both Jews and Sikhs invisible to policymakers, therefore ignoring the inequality and discrimination both groups face. That is why a specific Jewish and Sikh ethnic category is needed, and that is what this bill will do. Mr. Speaker, this is a campaign to end the discrimination both communities face. I campaigned for a Sikh and Jewish ethnic tick box to be included in the 2021 census because we know public bodies have been instructed for over 30 years to use the design of the census ethnic groups question to design and deliver services in compliance with equalities legislation. As protected characteristics, you would expect that public bodies are instructed to routinely collect information on Sikhs and Jews, but they are not. As an Equalities Minister wrote to me last year, public bodies and decision makers who think that the decisions may affect discrimination, harassment or victimisation of Sikhs should ensure that their compliance with the duty includes considerations of Sikh ethnicity. But they don't, because people incorrectly argue and assume data collected on religion is a suitable substitute. Those people don't understand the existing practices. Religion data is rarely collected to a good standard. It excludes non-practising Sikhs and Jews and is not used by public bodies to monitor and reduce inequalities or provide public services, and the latter is key to this argument. Sikhs and Jews are missing from whole swathes of public data: education, housing, crime, health, criminal justice, the public sector workforce, the ethnicity pay gap. The proposal in this bill would allow public bodies to start systematically collecting data on Sikhs and Jews to address the discrimination and inequalities they face, especially as the government has made a commitment to require ethnicity pay gap reporting. In presenting this bill today, I have the support of a wide range of community organisations, including the Sikh Council, 112 UK Gurdwaras, and organisations, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust, and the Community Security Trust. I would like to provide the House with a few examples of why this bill is so important. The pandemic shone a harsh light on the inequalities between different ethnic groups. Many experts in public health now recognise that we were too slow to recognise that some ethnic groups were dying at a far higher rate than others. The Office of National Statistics belatedly started analysing COVID-related deaths data by religious group where data was available, a short-term exercise that has since been discontinued. It found that Sikhs died disproportionately from COVID, either after adjusting for region, population density, area deprivation, household composition, socio-economic status, and a range of other economic indicators. Not only this, it showed that Sikhs were affected at a very different rate to other predominantly South Asian groups, meaning that analysis using the existing ethnic minority categories would fail to capture any of these inequalities. The Board of Deputies has also recognised these arguments. British Jews died at almost twice the rate of the rest of the population, with the higher prevalence of certain genetic conditions among Jewish people. Collecting better data will help public services profile and respond to the community better. For example, breast cancer in Ashkenazi women. Surely, to address health inequalities, we need to learn from the pandemic and collect accurate data to address outcomes for both these communities, given the huge evidence base. And to give just one example which highlights the absurdity of this system, the NHS Blood and Transplant Authority does not collect data on Sikh organ donors or Sikhs requiring an organ transplant, despite a policy of more than a decade of trying to encourage more Sikhs to become donors. They do not hold the single most important data point that would allow us to improve sign-up rates in this underrepresented group. It's simply shocking. And as Amanda Bowman, Vice President of the Board of Deputies, wrote last year, imagine you're sitting in a hospital, she said, waiting room, and have been asked to fill out a form which, among other questions, asks for your ethnicity. So which box do I tick? As David Baddiel, the author of Jews Don't Count, has said, it is othering and alienating that Jews do not have a distinct ethnic box to reflect their race. Since October the 7th, the British Jewish community have faced an appalling rise in anti-Semitic hate attacks. While the Home Office collects data on anti-Semitic hate crimes by religion, it doesn't on racially aggravated anti-Semitism. And this is despite racial hate crime outnumbering religiously aggravated hate crime by 10 to 1. There is therefore a serious risk that Jewish hate crimes are being undercounted by the Home Office because they do not have their own Jewish ethnic category. And in the first half of this year, the Community Security Trust found that the majority of anti-Semitic incidents they recorded consisted of anti-Jewish discourse linking the victim to Israel, Palestine, the Hamas terror attack, or the subsequent war. And according to the CPS prosecution guidance, hate targeting someone's real or perceived nationality or national origins, such as a link to Israel, would indicate a racially, not religiously aggravated offence. And the same goes for Sikhs, as has been documented in the APPG on British Sikhs report into anti-Sikh hate. Sikhs are the most visible minority in Britain, yet we do not collect data on racist anti-Sikh hate. The last government's hate crime action plan effectively ignored Sikh hate or the definition of anti-Sikh hate. Herein is the fundamental problem with consigning Sikhs and Jews to exercises focused on religious data and not ethnicity. Religion is not a mandatory field in terms of crime reporting standards set by the Home Office for police forces, apart from in religiously aggravated hate crime cases only. However, police forces are required to record ethnicity or EA codes using census categories where Sikhs and Jews do not exist, despite recognition in the Equality Act. Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services produced at least 30 different reports since 2017 criticising police forces for the poor recording of data on the ethnicity of victims of crime. A final example, in October, the Chief Executive of UK Jewish Film Festival warned of the erasure of British Jewish culture from national cultural life by arts bodies, which are of course publicly funded. Benjamin Till, a BAFTA-nominated composer, told the Jewish Chronicle that the Arts Council doesn't allow Jewish people to identify as anything other than a religion, and insists it must accept that Jewishness is a cultural and an ethnic identity. And as the APPG on British Sikhs and Board of Deputies have warned, even on its own merits, using religious questions to capture data on our communities will increasingly become irrelevant. The percentage of Sikhs and Jews who identify with their ethnic group but do not practice their religion is growing. And as Britain becomes increasingly secular, we are failing to recognise how British Sikhs and Jews face discrimination in other ways. Ethnicity data can capture this in ways that religion data doesn't. And as the Board of Deputies has said, we are concerned that until this situation is rectified, many Jewish citizens will not feel fully counted. As a former Cabinet Member for Public Health and Protection in Sandwell Council, Sikhs and Jews are forgotten when it comes to the design of services because there is no ethnicity data on Jews and Sikhs to inform those decisions. In rare cases where we do have data, it exposes glaring inequalities. 2018, 5.3% of homeless deaths in London were Sikh versus 1.3% of the general population in the city. And 27% of Sikhs in the UK report someone in their family has an alcohol addiction. Good quality data saves lives. In the past few years, the Office for National Statistics has come to acknowledge the need to ensure the ethnicity standard reflects the diversity of the UK population. That surely means it is time to address this injustice facing Sikh and Jewish people. Whatever the future of ethnicity data collection, we must routinely be included in our own right. If you consider our legal status as ethnic groups, we should be included. If you consider the size of our populations, we should be included. And if you consider our contribution to Great Britain and society, we should be included. If you consider the specific forms of discrimination and inequalities we face, we should be included. What our communities are asking for is fairness and justice, to be counted as ethnic groups, given we have been recognised as such in law for over 40 years. And as David Baddiel has argued, identifying anti-Semitism as religious intolerance rather than racism downgrades its importance, which is what leads to Jews not counting. The same goes for Sikhs, and this is not just a rhetorical point. It is literally the case that regarding Sikhs and Jews as a religious category means we are not counted. We are not counted when we fill in a form in an NHS waiting room. We're not counted in the census, and local councils don't count us in the data they use to monitor and deliver services. Mr. Speaker, it's high time that changed, and so I urge members across the House to allow this bill to progress today. It's high time that public bodies ended this injustice, and as legislators, we must put this wrong right and support them to do that. Thank you.
That the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare to bring in the bill?
Ben Coleman, Jazz Atwell, John Pearce, David Pinto-Duchinsky, Joni Reid, Alex Sobel and myself.
What you do? Get out. Order, order. This is totally unacceptable. Members are really going to have to think about how they treat fellow members in this chamber. Preet Corgill.
Public Body Ethnicity Data Inclusion of Jewish and Sikh Categories Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday, the 7th of March.
Friday, the 7th of March. We now come to the motion in the name of the Leader of the Opposition on UK farming and inheritance tax. I inform the House that I have selected Amendment A, tabled in the name of the Prime Minister. I now call Shadow Secretary of State Victoria Atkins to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I beg to move the motion on the order paper. This government has driven farmers to despair. The hike in national insurance, the acceleration of delinked payments, the fertiliser tax, the double cab tax, the stalling of capital grants, the scrapping of the Rural Services Delivery Grant, and the slowing down of applications to farming schemes are all conspiring against our rural economy and the survival of British farms. Yet they've added a death tax to this, the family farm tax, which is seeing families across the United Kingdom worry about whether they will be able to hand on their farms to their children as generations have done before them. In the 36 days since Labour's budget, the Chancellor, the Secretary of State and the ministers have tried to justify their family farm tax that will break up family farms by claiming that only 500 farms will be affected each year. Awkwardly, the figures used by the Chancellor are contradicted by figures produced by DEFRA. The left hand doesn't know what the far left hand is doing, Mr. Speaker. And when this figure was queried by the NFU, the CLA, the TFA, the farmers across the United Kingdom and us Conservatives, ministers told us, all rather patronisingly, we didn't understand and that farmers should seek professional advice. Well, farmers have sought professional advice, and that professional advice has revealed just how badly wrong the non-economist Chancellor has got her numbers. I won't, please. in a moment. Since the budget, the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers has analysed the family farm tax and applied tax law and the realities of modern-day farming to it. This analysis has revealed that up to 75,000 individual owners of farming businesses could be affected over the coming generation, even before inflation. That is the equivalent of 5 times the government's figure of 500 farms affected in 2026-27. How could they have got this so wrong? Because this city-dwelling Chancellor, Secretary of State and Exchequer Secretary don't understand modern farming or the countryside. They have overlooked a major area of tax policy and forgotten to consider thousands of farmers. As the Exchequer Secretary has confirmed, they forgot to include one of the 3 routes to this relief in their calculations. They have not included BPR-only claims in their figures. This means that as many as 14,000 tenant farmers who cannot claim APR because they do not own the land on which they farm are absent from their calculations. And what is worse is that ministers don't actually know how many farmers are affected by this. The city-dwelling Chancellor and Secretary of State have also forgotten about the farmers who followed professional advice in years gone by and transferred their farms into companies or partnerships. These farmers will only claim BPR and so have been left out of these calculations. Again, ministers don't know how many farmers are in this position. And I am told, I will in a minute, and I am told by advisers that some farmers choose to use BPR only because it's easier in probate. Guess what? Yet again, ministers don't know how many farms are in this position and they have not been included. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman and then I'll give way to the honourable lady, because I've...
Can I commend the Shadow Minister very much for bringing this forward? And this, I think it's a collective decision for this debate in the House is one that my farmers and my constituents would very much support. In relation to the professional advice, I'm a member, declaring interest as a member of the Ulster Farmers Union. We have sought legal advice through the Ulster Farmers Union. Professional advice, it indicates that somewhere in the region of 65% of farmers in Northern Ireland that are small farmers, family farms, will be affected by this. So when it comes to understanding this, has Labour not really got it? Have no idea what's going on?
None, not a clue.
I thank my honourable friend for intervening, and the evidence is building again and again against the assurances that the Chancellor, the Secretary of State for DEFRA, Exchequer Secretary and the Farming Minister have given this House. And frankly, the farmers outside deserve better, but frankly, so do we as Members of Parliament. So I'm going to give way to the honourable lady there, and then I'm going to carry on with the calculations that have been got so wrong by this government.
I thank the right honourable member for giving way. The Shadow Secretary of State left a trail of destruction across the government. She is the Health Secretary who broke the NHS, the Prisons Minister who ran out of prison places, and the Treasury Minister who crashed the economy. No wonder her constituency majority crashed from 28 to 5,000. Does she not think it's time to apologise and support, for once, the government who is bringing back stability to British economy and farmers' profitability?
Order. I know members are jeering about reading. I know it used to be a rule when I came in the House that you shouldn't read. Both sides are doing it. Remember that. Sorry. I've got a point of order. You're a good friend, of course.
And this point of order is spontaneous, unlike that
line over there.
It has. I am Mr. Spontaneity, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you're entirely right that many right honourable and honourable members read almost verbatim their speeches. But it is surely just rude and discourteous to this House to read a supposedly spontaneous intervention as if it's just come into the mind of the honourable lady, but she managed to have a typewriter and a printer in order to write down 2 pages of an intervention.
Well, what I can say is as I expected. Spontaneity didn't make it a point of order. Shall the Secretary of State?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the first female Prime Minister said, if they're going after you personally, it means you're winning the argument. But let me help the Honourable Lady. Let me help the Honourable Lady with the second set of calculations, which her Chancellor has got so wrong. Because the Chancellor's cockeyed accounting doesn't stop there. It in fact extends to the claim that farmers will be able to transfer £3 million tax-free. This is wrong. Only a few, in a very specific set of circumstances, will be able to claim this magic figure. To the jeers opposite, it is not available to widows. It is not available to people who are single. It is not available to people who own the farm with another relative. And their magic £3 million figure assumes that the surviving spouse lives some sort of monastic existence where they have no personal effects to pass on to their loved ones. As farmers from Sussex have asked, why are widows' families being targeted? Yes. A family wrote to me about their mother, who is a widow. They have calculated that they face an additional £200,000 in Labour's tax bill because their father died before the budget and so did not know to transfer his allowance. Now, we know that there are some Labour members of Parliament who have concerns. The Honourable Member for South West Norfolk, who represents over 500 farms, I don't know whether he's here today, has asked for assurances on the accuracy of figures being used by the government. Given this demolition of the Chancellor's figures by the CAAV and many others, will he vote for the family farms in his constituency, or will he toe the party line? And the CAAV's concern about the figures being peddled by the government is shared by the IFS, CBI Economics and even the OBR. But it isn't just about the numbers. It is the emotional toll that this terrible tax that the members opposite need to understand. The worry, the distress, the sense of betrayal felt by families which should stop ambitious Labour MPs in their tracks today before they parrot without question the figures given to them by their ministers. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady. I hope she doesn't fall into the category I've just described, and then I'll give way.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. She talks about the figures. Would she accept the record of her government is leaving £300 million of the farming budget unspent, left in the Treasury coffers, not helping farmers?
May I thank her sincerely for raising that point, because she has, perhaps unwittingly, identified a contradiction in DEFRA's own claims. They talk about £300 million underspend, and then last week they were cancelling the very capital grants that farmers around the country have been investing in, saying that they've run out of money. Well, it can't be both ways, but perhaps this is yet another example of the Chancellor's and DEFRA Secretary's cockeyed accounting. I give way.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. And does my right honourable friend agree with me that what is quite frightening about this policy is that maybe they do know exactly what they're doing, but a bit like Animal Farm, they think everything should be collectivised?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, in fact, has a wonderful way with words, and he is asking a question that actually many members of rural communities up and down the United Kingdom are asking themselves, as in fact the wonderful presenter on BBC Radio Lincolnshire, Sean Dunderdale, asked the Prime Minister when he came on to do regional media a couple of weeks ago, what has the Prime Minister got against the people of Lincolnshire? I might ask, what has this Labour government got against the countryside? I'll give way to my honourable friend and neighbour, and then I'll make...
I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and as she has said, the word betrayal is fitting, because pledges were given, both by the Secretary of State and by the Prime Minister, long before the election, that these changes would not be made. So this is a...
He's a very experienced member of this House, and he knows he's meant to address the chair, not the front bench. Come on, John.
Mr. Speaker, I know that you, being a man of integrity and honour, will be as disappointed as I am that the government should promise one thing and then do the exact opposite.
May I thank my right honourable friend and friend, who, as my I have the great pleasure to have, as, not just as a friend, but also as my Lincolnshire neighbour. He has absolutely put his finger on the point, so much so it is genuinely the next paragraph in my speech. And I can help him with the phrasing that should haunt some Labour MPs, because I suspect that they repeated this phrasing when they were up and down the market towns and villages in their constituencies. In the general election campaign, the Secretary of State described fears that Labour would impose this family farm tax as desperate nonsense. Now, Labour candidates will have repeated that line and assured the farming families in their constituencies that Labour would never treat rural communities in that way. Yet we know, within weeks, the Chancellor was planning to do exactly that. And since then, families across the country have been trying to work out how they pick up the pieces after Labour's family farm tax bomb. They will not forget. Our hard work and investment as a family has been wiped away in the stroke of a pen. A farmer from Derbyshire emailed me this week. My 60-year-old husband had a bleed on the brain in June and thankfully has made a full recovery. But I've never seen him so stressed. He doesn't know what to do. The honourable members representing seats in Derbyshire may wish to reflect on how they will respond to that. I will make some progress. A farmer from Northumberland has written to me as follows. We had to talk about which one of my parents are going to die first in front of them. He says, his words, Labour is destroying people's lives with this policy. Many of us are worried about the mental state of many within agriculture and are concerned that it may be the final straw for some. Now, in fairness, I will in a moment, in fairness, the honourable member for Hexham, who's in his place, has voiced concerns about whether his government is listening to ordinary people about this. Will he vote for his farmers, or will he toe the party line? I will give way, and then...
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Mr Speaker, as a farmer's wife, I understand the emotional impact which my right honourable friend is setting out so clearly. This is not just about the farmers who will be affected, but it is all the farmers who know they might be affected. This is a tax on tragedy, and no one knows who will befall it of them.
Well, may I thank my honourable friend and indeed Lincolnshire neighbour, and she sets out exactly the personal impact of this, which, you know, I know how it is as a Treasury Minister, what it is to look at the spreadsheets and the terribly impressive packs of information from civil servants. I also know that Chancellor after Chancellor, and I would just remind the members opposite that this is deeply serious, it's not a joke, it's not a joke, that the Chancellors after Chancellors have looked at these figures and have come again to the conclusion this is a political decision, and I'm afraid the current Chancellor in XST has got it wrong. I give way to the honourable gentleman, then I'm going to make some progress.
Thank you, Shadow Secretary of State, for giving way. And you make a really important point here about the health and well-being of our farmers. And given that when she was the Health Secretary, waiting times for operations were almost 3 times higher than back in 2010. Does she not welcome the investment this government is putting into our NHS?
Don't worry, I'll deal with this. May I thank the honourable gentleman for raising the important issue of mental health in farming, but across the National Health Service. I was very proud, actually, to work with the government, both as a Member of Parliament, but also as Secretary of State for Health, in massively increasing the investment in mental health services. I'm sure, if he's a rural MP, will know how isolated farmers can be and the pressures on their emotions. At the best of times, they have the weather, they have diseases, they have crop cycles to contend with. Of course, this added pressure, merely as we've already heard from some of the farmers that have contacted me, added to this. And I would also just gently remind him that the figure that this family farm tax, or tax on tragedy, as my honourable friend has called it so bleakly, raises 500 million in 26-27. That is equivalent, according to the King's Fund, to about a day's worth of services in the NHS in England. So it isn't going to be quite the game changer that some in his party believe it to be. And what about the family in the southwest whose beloved father died a decade ago in tragic circumstances, leaving 3 young children who are now in their teens? The mother has run the farm and brought up their children in the midst of their grief. She has now been diagnosed with a life-threatening illness at the age of 50. 2 of the children want to carry on the farm when they reach 18, but should the unthinkable happen and they lose their mum, then they will be saddled with Labour's family farm tax of £700,000. What empathetic and meaningful response does the Secretary of State, who isn't in his place today, where is he? What empathetic and meaningful response does he, or indeed the Treasury Minister, have for this family? They will be watching and they will be listening. Now, we've taken the unusual step, actually, of giving lots of notice to Labour MPs that we would be debating Labour's family farm tax today. We did this because we wanted to give Labour MPs in rural seats time to reflect and consider whether they can continue to support this vindictive tax. For example, a Welsh landowner contacted me to tell me that he will have to sell 6 tenanted farms in order to pay Labour's family farm tax. That is 6 farming families who we in this House, on this side of the House, would describe as working people, who will lose their businesses, their family homes and their children's farming future. 6 farming families who we now know have been forgotten by this government. So I wonder, the Honourable Member for Montgomeryshire has called on the Treasury to produce its modelling on the impact on family farms. Will the Treasury do that at the backbencher's request, and how will he vote today? And the Honourable Member for South East Cornwall met farmers earlier this month and claimed she would take their concerns back to Westminster. Will she be raising those today and voting against this tax? In conclusion, very much.
Grateful to my right honourable friend. I've consulted widely with farming communities and with farmers in my own parliamentary constituency, Herne Bay and Sandwich. I have not been able to identify a single farmer that feels that there is anything good in this policy whatsoever. Do my right honourable friend suggest whether or not there is a single Labour Member of Parliament representing a rural community who genuinely believes that they will be voting in their constituents' interests tonight?
I thank sincerely my right honourable friend, and he sets out very clearly the choice ahead of members across the House. We know on this side who we are standing up for. We know that we back our farmers. We understand how difficult farming is as a way of life. And it will be for individual members of Parliament, to decide how they vote. I'm going to give way to the honourable gentleman, and then I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank the right honourable lady for giving way. Talking about choices and backing farmers, the current leader of the opposition did a trade deal with Australia and New Zealand that sold farmers down the river. Is that the type of choices and her version of backing British farmers?
Selling them out.
I'm pretty sure the honourable gentleman's got his facts wrong on that in terms of the Trade Secretary. But in terms of trade deals, we on this side of the House, yes, we are in favour of trade deals, but of course we want trade deals that best support our farming industry. And he will know, for example, he will know before they start shouting at me, he will know that the fears and concerns outlaid with those trade deals, in fact, have not come to fruition. And what is more, we as Conservatives are proud of the fact that we would not enter trade deals which require the flooding of chlorinated chicken or hormone-treated beef on these shores. And I would just gently remind the honourable gentleman that talking about foreign territories, particularly in the context of the debate about the Chagos Islands, is a little bit brave of the backbencher. Anyway, here we go, my honourable friend.
Suggest we've not got much trade from the Chagos Islands. Simon Hall.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and she is right to highlight the devastating effect of this policy, and also right to highlight the incredibly rounding up exercise on the Treasury account books of contribution that this will make to NHS expenditure. But does she not also find it rather inept politics, maybe not surprising from such a London-centric front bench, that for the first time since 1945, the governing party has a serious foothold in rural constituencies across the UK? This policy shows a willful ignorance of rural life, a deliberate attempt not to understand what the pressures are, and is in essence selling those rural Labour MPs down the river.
I thank my honourable friend for that, and indeed there's some interesting polling coming out today which I'm going to deal with. And of course, Mr Speaker, I very much accept your point about trade. I would, however, note that we are genuinely concerned about the national security implications of the Chagos Island deal, but we'll see.
Lady, so am I. Come on.
Very much so. In conclusion, therefore, Mr Speaker, before... Oh, I will give way. Go on. The honourable gentleman for Hexham. Is he going to...
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I commend her commitment to honesty. But when she talks about giving Labour members advance sight of the Opposition Day motion, could she tell me when the Labour Whip's office received the title of the Opposition Day debate? And could I perhaps invite her to correct the record?
Well, in fairness, I'm so sorry. The honourable gentleman was obviously speaking to farmers in his constituency on Sunday, and I think there's a debate. Did I hear there's a protest going on in his constituency at the moment? But I actually announced it on national television on Sunday, so perhaps he wasn't watching it. But in any event, national television. I mean, farmers will. Do you know, farmers at home will be wondering what on earth they're arguing over. Anyway, in conclusion, before I will give way.
One word that she hasn't mentioned is Brexit, the great Tory disaster of the last Parliament. How much does she estimate Brexit cost farmers in the rural community?
If I may, because he and I unusually can join forces on this, because whilst I'm going to resist the temptation to revisit Brexit, what I will do is point to him. Paragraph 4 of the CAAV report mentions the peculiar legal impact of this decision to impose a family farm tax.
Order. Can I... Sorry, you're totally the wrong way and I can't pick it up here. Please, Victoria Ackles.
Forgive me, please. I'm reminded paragraph 4 of the CAAV report in fact sets out the peculiar legal problems posed by the family farm tax in the context of Scottish farming tenants. It's incredibly complicated, but that is a real concern, and I trust that the SNP will be exploring this alongside Conservative members of Parliament as well. So in conclusion, Mr Speaker, before ambitious backbenchers, or indeed the Exchequer Secretary, get to their feet and accuse these farmers and us of scaremongering, something they have been happy to do in the past, think on, discover some humility and compassion, and ask why tens of thousands of decent, hard-working and sensible people across the United Kingdom know that the Chancellor has got it so wrong. Polling by the CLA today shows what the public thinks. They don't think farmers should be whacked with the family farm tax. They think that Labour have broken their promise to end countryside decline. They think the government should be cutting taxes on rural businesses, and 70% are not confident that the Labour government can deliver growth to rural communities. So I say to every honourable member opposite, do the right thing. Stand up for our farmers, who are the best in the world and whose produce is renowned globally. They feed us, and now they need us. Labour MPs need to join us and axe the family farm tax.
The question is, as on the order paper, I call James Murray to move the amendment. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I welcome the chance to open this debate on behalf of the Government, and I beg to move the amendment in the name of the Prime Minister. Mr Speaker, the Government's commitment to farmers is steadfast. As our amendment makes clear, farmers make an immense contribution to the UK economy and the nation's food security. we recognise and respect the crucial contribution that farmers make to our country's way of life. We must also recognise, Mr. Speaker, that this government has come to power at a time when the state of our public services and the mess in which we found the public finances means there was no way we could have left things as they were. Unlike the party opposite, there was never any question of us ignoring the £22 billion black hole we uncovered in the public finances. We had to bring the previous administration's fiscal irresponsibility to an end. We had to make sure our country now lives within its means, and we had to get public services back on their feet whilst meeting our tough new fiscal rules that end borrowing for day-to-day spending. That is what we, as a responsible government, had to do. That is why, Mr. Speaker, at the autumn budget, the Chancellor set out a number of difficult but necessary decisions on tax, welfare and spending. These decisions were to restore economic stability, fix the public finances and rebuild our public services. And one of those decisions we took was to reform agricultural and business property relief. We chose to reform these measures in a way that maintains significant tax relief for family farms whilst fixing the public finances in as fair a way as possible. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Way, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Gentleman wants to explain this. The government have argued that only 27% of farms will be affected by this. The NFU say it's 75%. Would he at least give us an indication of this backbox, perhaps supported by a note from the Library of the House, showing the modelling that contradicts the NFU's figures?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and in fact I might point him toward the letter the Chancellor recently sent to the Treasury Select Committee, which sets out some of these figures in detail. I think some of the confusion that maybe he and other honourable members have encountered comes from the fact that there are different sets of data they're referring to. The set of data he may be referring to relates to the total value of farms across the country. Whereas if we are thinking about the inheritance tax claims, it is right to look at HMRC claims data on inheritance tax, because looking simply at the value of a farm does not tell you what the inheritance tax liability for that farm may be, given that you have to look, for instance, at the ownership structure, who owns what, any liabilities, and so on. So that may be where some of his confusion is coming from. I will give way.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way, but at Treasury Questions yesterday, I raised with him the case of Upper Peppersill Farm in Long Crendon, a small 380-acre arable farm in my constituency that the Shadow Secretary of State and Leader of the Opposition visited a few weeks ago. They've calculated that if they borrow the money to pay this new tax, it will take them 40 years to pay it back. So will the Minister give a message of what he says to the Seed family in Long Crendon about that tax bill they face?
Mr. Speaker, it's not appropriate for me as a Minister to give specific tax advice to one family, but I will talk about the general principles that we're approaching in our reform. And I was about to begin setting out some of the detail about our policy.
Right. On the general principle, is the Minister seriously saying that all the tax advisors advising all the farmers across the country and all the land valuers who are qualified in a way that the Minister is not are wrong and that he is right?
Mr. Speaker, what I'm explaining is how the data for claims through HMRC, which shows the claims made under agricultural property relief and business property relief, is the correct set of data to work out future liabilities on that basis. That is what the projections that we've put out are based on. That is in the Chancellor's letter to the Treasury Select Committee that I mentioned, and I would urge him and his colleagues to review that letter to understand the data which I'm talking about in more detail. I would like to make a bit of progress to explain some of the detail behind our policy, which may answer some of the questions which I see honourable members are jumping to their feet to question. Because, Mr. Speaker, we know that inheritance tax is always an emotive issue, and understandably so. It is a natural desire that people have to want to pass on their assets to the people they love when they pass away. Now, looking at the history of inheritance tax, we know that the standard single rate of inheritance tax has been 40% since 1988, and assets have generally long been entitled to nil rate bans, reliefs and exemptions. A form of relief for agricultural property was introduced on estate duty in Finance Act 1948. meaning that this duty was then charged at 55% of the rate that would normally have applied. A new agricultural property relief and a business property relief were created in the mid-1970s with the introduction of the capital transfer tax. The rate of relief increased over time to a maximum of 50% relief, and that maximum rate was then increased to 100% in 1992. This means, Mr. Speaker, that agricultural landowners and farmers did not receive 100% relief for almost all of the 20th century, and yet farms passed down between the generations. Now, we recognise that agricultural and business property... I'll give way.
Minister for giving way. That was why the law was changed to introduce 100% relief, because family farms weren't getting passed down because the value of land was increasing. Can he consider that before he thinks about the changes that he's bringing in?
Well, Mr. Speaker, to address the honourable gentleman's point, we recognise that agricultural and business property relief play an important role in supporting family farms, but the full, unlimited exemption from inheritance tax has simply become unsustainable, and the 4 most recent years' worth of data make clear why. This data shows that a very small number of agricultural property relief claimants, including those who claimed business property relief too, benefited from a very significant amount of relief. In total, 47% of the exchequer cost of the relief went to the top 7% of claims. Just to be clear what this means, to put it another way, for every 14 or so estates, the top 1 amongst them claimed half the total relief. I'll give way.
Mr. Speaker, what concerns me most is there hasn't been an impact assessment, but if the major driver for the government, whether we accept it or not, was to raise some money from this source, why weren't other more effective mechanisms used, such as business rollover relief, where a business could be sold in another context, rolled over into buying land and deferring capital gains tax? If that mechanism had been used, then money would have been taken from much wealthier people who weren't actually producing food in the first place. And now we're capturing a massive proportion of small family farms completely unnecessarily because due consideration of better alternatives was not considered by the Minister.
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can reassure the honourable gentleman, who personally I have a lot of respect for, that we carefully considered how to calibrate this policy to ensure that there is significant relief from inheritance tax still available to family farms, whilst at the same time fixing the public finances in as fair a possible way. And Mr. Speaker, I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way. He's just referred to his analysis of 4 years of data, which led him and the government to this position. That is an incredible thing to ask the House to believe, because just a few months ago, his right honourable friends, the now Prime Minister and Secretary of State, were specifically ruling out these policies to audiences of farmers and to landowners. So if the data of 4 years standing told him that this was the right policy, why were those now ministers economical with the actuality when they spoke to the farmers themselves?
Okay.
Mr. Speaker, the data we didn't have before the general election was the £22 billion black hole that his party left in the public finances, and he knows that because it is acknowledged by the Office of Budget Responsibility that the full information was not shared with them. They have said their forecast would have been materially different had they known that was the case, and we have had to take a number of difficult decisions, but I'm going to make some progress. Yes, I will. Yes.
Just speaking of data, that reminds me. Over 12,000 farmers and agri-businesses have gone out of business since 2010. Could the Minister assure me what we're doing to improve profitability in British farming?
Minister.
Yeah, well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight the decimation of businesses by the Conservatives' time in office. And what we know that businesses across the economy need is stability, is public finances on a firm footing, and investment in our public services. That is what businesses across the country need to invest and grow for the future. But, Mr. Speaker, I will give her one more time, then I'll make some progress.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. He's a Treasury Minister. Can I suggest that some of the disparity between the Treasury figures and other reputable bodies representing agricultural interests is because of land values? Average values in the Cotswolds are now for ordinary land £15,000 an acre. So will he accede to my right honourable friend for Salisbury, who was a former Chief Secretary of the Treasury, and publish an up-to-date impact assessment of how many farms this tax will affect?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, a lot of data has already been published through, as I mentioned, the Chancellor's letter to the Treasury Select Committee, and further details on the impact will be published alongside the draft legislation in the normal way. So I suggest maybe he reads the letter to the Treasury Select Committee, and as he and his honourable friend behind him will know, the impacts are typically published at the time of draft legislation, which is the normal process, which was indeed the norm under the previous government. I'm going to make some I'll take one more intervention and I'll make some progress.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. Some of the correspondence that I've received on this issue talks about the fact that these measures inflate land value. Does the honourable member agree with that assessment? And what will these changes do to help farmers across the country in that respect?
No.
Yes, but my honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight the fact that some of the features of the current inheritance tax relief from this system means that it is an attractive vehicle for tax planning to reduce inheritance tax liability. So people who have wealth who have never been farmers and are not intending to become farmers have been using this as a way to avoid inheritance tax. In fact, reducing that should take some of the pressure out of land values when it comes to agriculture, and I would hope help to make a more sustainable farming sector in the future. I'm going to make some progress. I've given way.
It's important to get the facts right and get the right number of farms in frame. And the Minister must know that the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers has put the estimate the government has made down by a factor of 5. There are 75,000 farms, according to impartial, independent review of this, that will be in frame for this tax, not the figure the Minister's relying upon.
Mr. Speaker, my response to the honourable gentleman is the same as I said to his honourable friend behind him, which is I believe he is looking at the data of the total value of farms rather than of inheritance tax claims. The two are different things. You could, for instance, have a farm which is worth £5 million, owned in equal shares by 5 individuals, and would have no inheritance tax liability because of the way that claims works. That is where some of this confusion, I think, comes from, and there is different data around the value of farms and around the value of inheritance tax claims. But for the purposes of the debate today, it is inheritance tax claims which are the right data to focus on. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to make some... I'll give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. On the point of facts, I was fascinated by the contribution at the end of the Shadow Minister's statement just then, around the issue of... around the issue of whether, well, the honourable member was opining on whether Labour was sticking to its promise, quote, to end the decline in the countryside. I wonder who was in government for the last 14 years when the countryside was declining, when their government sold out British farmers through trade deals and 12,000 farming businesses went out of business. Does my honourable friend agree?
Sir.
I very much agree with my honourable friend, and he has pointed out a repeated pattern of the opposition is their total refusal to take any responsibility for the damage they caused over the last 14 years. They may wish it never happened, the British people disagree. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm going to make some progress because I had just set out some of the statistics about why this tax relief has been very concentrated in a small number of claims. And so in that context, and in the context of the dire fiscal situation we inherited and the critical need to fix the public finances and get public services back on their feet, it cannot be right to maintain such a significant level of relief for a very small number of claimants. Now, that is why, from April the 6th, 2026, the full 100% relief from inheritance tax will be restricted to the first £1 million of combined agricultural and business property. Above this amount, there will be an unlimited 50% relief, so inheritance tax will be paid at a reduced effective rate of up to 20% rather than the standard 40%. The new system, it should be noted, remains more generous than in the past. As I mentioned, the rate of relief prior to 1992 was a maximum of 50% on all agricultural and business assets, including the first £1 million. The reliefs we are providing will be on top of all the other exemptions and nil rate bans that people can access for inheritance tax too. So taken in combination, this means that a couple with farmland will typically be able to pass on up to £3 million worth of assets to their descendants without paying any inheritance tax. I'm not going to give it. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
For giving way. The CAAV, the Central Association of Agriculture Valuers, have called that £3 million figure unrealistic and unreasonable. Does he not agree with them?
The £3 million figure is what a typical couple could expect to pass on to their direct descendants using the various nil rate bands and inheritance tax reliefs. I would advise any specific family to get advice from an accountant or a financial advisor, but in terms of the scale of reliefs, when you combine the inheritance tax relief through agricultural and business property relief, along with the nil rate bans, nil rate residence bans and transferability between spouses, that is how we come to the figure of £3 million. I will give way.
For giving way. Given that he appears to be leading on this issue for the government rather than Secretary of State for Farming, can he tell me how many farmers he has personally met with over the last 3 months? Because he seems very confident about how this is going to impact on them. So the exact number, please, of how many farmers you have personally met over the last 3 months.
Figures are there.
How many farmers I have met? Minister. One. Minister.
A number of times with the NFU since the budget to discuss in detail representing the farming industry, and that has helped us to understand the impact this policy will have and ask for their support in communicating how this policy will work. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm going to make some progress. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm going to continue to explain how some of the other exemptions within the inheritance tax system will benefit people who are affected by this policy. I'll give way.
Can the Minister confirm that, of course, when we're talking about farms worth several £1 million, that, of course, any mortgageable value is not included for IHT, and may explain some of the discrepancy between some of the figures going around, where, of course, I believe that mortgages have not been taken into account?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point, which is exactly why looking at the pure asset value of farms does not tell you what their inheritance tax liability might be. As she rightly points out, any liabilities must be netted off against the value of any estate, and of course the ownership structure, the various nil rate bans, previous spousal transfers, gifting and so on would need to be considered. Now I'm going to make some progress because, as my honourable friend has pointed out, there are a range of exemptions which need to be considered, because we know that full exemptions for transfers between spouses and civil partners continue to apply. Any transfers to individuals more than 7 years before death, as gifts will continue to fall fully outside the scope of inheritance tax, and taper relief will apply in certain circumstances within that time. Furthermore, any tax that is due in relation to these assets can be paid in instalments over 10 years, interest-free, payment terms that are more generous than any other part of the tax system. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I have mentioned several times during this debate, these decisions have been based on understandings that draw on data from both DEFRA and HMRC, and I see there has been some confusion, whether willing or not, on the other side about what the data shows.
They're always confused.
I'll give way.
Gentleman for giving way, and he makes an important point here. But the analysis looking at this is there's an average 350-acre arable farm owned by a couple. 99% of their profit over a 10-year period is going to go back towards paying that inheritance tax. That doesn't leave enough money to either invest or to actually live. And I just wonder how the honourable gentleman thinks they can deal with that.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm confident that in the way we have calibrated the policy, as I set out to the honourable gentleman over there, has been to balance the need to retain significant, generous provision of inheritance tax relief for family farms, whilst at the same time ensuring that we fix the public finances in as fair a possible way. I will give way one more time.
Extremely grateful that the honourable gentleman has been very generous. But I think, given the point that has just been made by my right honourable friend, would he not consider, at the very least, looking at some dispensation for farmers above a certain age, given the lack of time they will have to plan for this intervention? Because the truth is that if somebody is near retirement age, the prospect of having 10 years of all their projected profits being eaten up by paying this tax will mean that the farm will not be able to go to the next generation. He must look at some mitigations to deal with that reality for so many farmers who are, of course, concentrated in that older age group.
Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we know that individual circumstances will vary, and any individual who's concerned about their specific tax liability should obviously consult an accountant or financial advisor, because we would not know, for instance, from a thumbnail sketch whether that person had any inherited nil rate bans, what their liabilities are, what decisions they had made around gifting, and so on. So there is a huge number of factors which will play into this, and it is right that individuals get specific advice rather than things which are said in this chamber may be creating undue anxiety when people should be looking into the detail of what I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the Minister, and he seems to be trying to suggest that not much farmland is going to have to be sold off as a result of this. But his colleague, the Minister for Food Security, did a response to an urgent question on the 4th of December. And when I asked him how food security was going to be preserved if farms had to be broken up and sold off possibly for development, he replied, and I quote, "Of course there are trade-offs. There are a range of pressures on our land in respect of housing, food, energy, and so many other things. That seems to be an acceptance that we will lose farming land and people will be building on it instead."
We want homes.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, that's not how I interpret that comment, but I make no apology for the fact that we want to support farmers alongside making our energy transition and building homes for people across the country. We need to make sure that we are achieving all of the goals that people in this country elected us to do, and I make no apology for that. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I was about to talk more about data because that's been a point raised by several honourable members today, and as I've explained a few times now, the DEFRA data shows the asset value of farms in England. But as I've made clear, it is not possible to accurately infer a future inheritance tax liability from data on farm asset values. Any inheritance tax liabilities that farming assets may face would be affected by who the owners are, the nature of the ownership, how many owners there are, any borrowing they have, and how they plan their affairs. For example, a farmer... I will give way.
I'm most grateful to the Minister for giving way. The Minister talks about data, Madam Deputy Speaker. Will the Minister agree, given the massive discrepancy in the impact of this policy, that if the data shows in 12 months and 24 months that the government has got this catastrophically wrong, that you will actually revisit this policy and do a U-turn?
No. Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, when we approach policies in government, we thoroughly test them and consider the detail of their policies. We consider the data of that policy, and we make sure that any conclusions we draw are based on the correct set of data, which is part of the conversation that we are having today. And there is some, I don't know whether it's mischief or misunderstanding, but there is some focus on the total value of farms rather than on inheritance tax liabilities. It is inheritance tax liabilities which is the correct data to look at in evaluating the impact this policy may have. I'm going to make some progress, because as I said earlier, Madam Deputy Speaker, a farm worth £5 million but owned by 5 relatives in equal shares could have no inheritance tax liability. I will give way to the Liz Truss cheerleader on the backbenches.
I thank the Minister giving way. The CLA does point out that 46% of farms are owned by individuals, and the data produced in the letter does not take into account this, and it works more on couples getting the relief. Will the Minister look at this and take into account 46% of farms are owned by individuals?
Yeah.
Well, I see the honourable gentleman's grasp on economics is about as good as Liz Truss's was. But as I said, Madam Deputy Speaker, the importance of the claims data is that the claims data is what tells you what the inheritance tax liability is going to be. There are many other sources of sets of data which I understand people are referring to, but if we are looking at the impact of a change to inheritance tax relief, it is claims data which tells you what that is likely to be. And that is why I'm going to make some progress. I've given way many times already. And that is why the HMRC data, which relates to estates making claims for agricultural and business property relief, is the correct way to understand inheritance tax liabilities. These HMRC claims data show that our reforms are expected to result in up to 520 estates claiming agricultural property relief, including those who also claim business property relief, paying some inheritance tax in 26-27. Now, to put that in context, this means that almost 3/4 of estates claiming agricultural property relief, including those that also claim business property relief, will not pay any more. I'm going to make some progress. Will not pay any more tax as a result of these measures. Now, as this change is introduced, we expect people to respond in a number of ways to reduce their inheritance tax liabilities, and the costings by the Office of Budget Responsibility assume that this will be the case. People may change ownership structures, plan for their succession differently, and make greater use of gifting provisions and insurance. And at the same time, I'll give way.
The Minister for giving way. He's been very generous. He mentioned the claims of agricultural property relief and business property relief, but what of only business property relief? Have they been included in his figures?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention. And as we know, any farmer who is renting out land or farming it themselves will typically have an estate that includes an element that is eligible for agricultural property relief. The figures I set out include those who claim for business property relief as well, and those are the figures set out in the Chancellor's letter to the Treasury Select Committee. But as I was saying, Madam Deputy Speaker, yes, I will.
I'd like to thank him for giving way. Despite attempts from the opposition benches to hijack this debate, I can honestly say, Madam Deputy Speaker, if they wanted to be the champion of our agricultural communities, they might have started around 14 years ago. The conversations that I have had with farmers in my constituency have been balanced and productive in their scope, with an understanding of why these provisions are brought in. Would he agree with me that, given the fact that in 2023 2/3 of the land bought in England was bought by non-farmers, is it right that this government is taking this opportunity to close what is essentially a tax loophole for non-farmers?
Well, I thank my honourable friend very much for her intervention, and it is telling that when she is making such an important, sensible point, the opposition don't want to hear it, and they try and shout it down, because, as she rightly points out, as a result of our changes to these reliefs, it will make it less attractive as a means of inheritance tax planning. And this means that land prices are likely to become more affordable for farmers thanks to a reduction in tax-motivated investment in agricultural land. I've given way already. I'm going to make some progress because, of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, these reforms should also be seen in the context of the significant existing support for the farming industry in the wider tax system. This includes the exemption from business rates for agricultural land and buildings, the ongoing entitlement for vehicles and machinery used in agriculture to use rebated diesel and biofuels, and the exemption from the plastic packaging tax for the plastic film used to produce silage bales. On top of this, farmers are able to add together their profits from farming for 2 to 5 years and be taxable on the average of those profits, building flexibility into their tax arrangements for difficult years and unexpected challenges. I will give way.
The Minister for giving way. Would he agree with me that in the government's haste to target tax avoiders like Jeremy Clarkson and others, as has already been mentioned across the chamber, that you've actually caught a lot of small and medium-sized farmers in your sights in a completely irresponsible way?
Well, I'd like to say to the honourable gentleman that although our policy should discourage the kind of tax planning that I think he was referring to in his question, it is a broader policy than that, which is necessary to balance significant relief from inheritance tax for family farms with the need to fix the public finances. And that is the balanced decision that we have taken in this policy. And of course, the decision around this tax policy, Madam Deputy Speaker, sits alongside the government's wider decisions at Budget 2024, which sees £5 billion over 2 years for farming and land management in England, which will help restore stability and confidence in the sector. This includes the largest ever budget directed at sustainable food production and nature's recovery in our country's history. And despite the difficult fiscal inheritance, £60 million of funding has also been prioritised for the Farm Recovery Fund to support farmers with the impact of severe wet weather over the last year. I'll give way.
For giving way. He rightly mentions the need for more sustainable land management, but isn't it the case that these changes to APR are actually going to undermine the sustainable land management initiatives that farmers in mid-Sussex are trying to deliver every day?
No, that's not the case. And my honourable friend who will be responding at the end of this debate can set out more about what the government is doing to support farmers in their work for land management across the country. I'll give way to my honourable friend who tried to intervene.
Thank you, and thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I backed British farming ahead of the general election, and I back the farmers in my Shipley constituency, and I'm proud to sit on these benches where a Labour government is backing British farmers with an investment of £5 billion in the recent budget. So will my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, agree with me that it's absolutely essential that we make sure that that money gets into the pockets of our farmers, unlike the delays that my farmers have had to complain about from when the party opposite were in power?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right excuse me, to draw attention to the mismanagement under the previous government and how important it is that through the commitments we made at budget around the farming budget over the next 2 years, we support farmers across the country as evidence of our steadfast support. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I recognise that the reforms we are making to agricultural and business property relief will have an impact on some individuals. I recognise that some of the larger estates, particularly those over £3 million, may be affected by these changes. But the reforms to these reliefs will maintain very significant levels of relief from inheritance tax. At a total exchequer cost of over £1 billion in the year, the reforms take effect before rising further, and they offer support for family farms and businesses across the country. We could not justify leaving the situation unchanged, with a full, unlimited tax relief benefiting a very small number of estates by a very significant amount.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would he agree with me that, perhaps unsurprisingly given the name of their political party, the honourable members opposite are seeking to preserve the status quo, which includes the 7% of the wealthiest claimants accounting for 40% of the overall APR budget? Would my honourable friend agree with me that they need to set out how to make this situation fairer and a better deal for our agricultural sector?
Minister.
Yeah, well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to point out that the party opposite has no ideas about how the country needs to change, has no ideas about how to get the public finances back in order, has no ideas about how to get public services back on their feet or how to deliver economic stability. I'll give way.
Thank the Minister for giving way. Farmers in my constituency tell me how much they are struggling to see a GP, to get public transport. The buses just aren't there. The rural economy has been ruined by 14 years of the party opposite in government. Can the Minister reassure us that the necessary actions that we are taking in this budget will get our public services working for our farming and rural communities again?
Order. Interventions should relate to the debate in hand. Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I won't try your patience, but I feel it relates to the debate in hand, as this was a tough decision we had to take in regards to a taxation policy in order to fund our public services. And those public services are, of course, enjoyed by people across the country, including farmers and those in rural communities. And as I was saying, I'm going to make some clear. As I was saying, Madam Deputy Speaker, we could not justify leaving the situation unchanged, with a full, unlimited tax relief benefiting a very small number of estates by a very significant amount, when there is such an urgent need to repair the public finances, to improve the hospitals, schools and roads that people across the country, including in rural communities, depend on. Our approach... Oh, give way.
And I thank my honourable friend. There's lots of talk from the opposite benches who are getting very excited by this debate about farms, but also we have to remember that farms rely on farm workers as well. In the name of accuracy, could my honourable friend put on record for us a reminder of which parties opposite, including the Lib Dems, voted for the abolition of the Agricultural Wages Board in the last government and actually drove down rural wages, and that we should be talking about farm workers? Isn't it true the only thing the opposite benches want to talk about when they mean exemptions is exemption of their own record being under scrutiny?
Well, my honourable friend makes a powerful point about the record of the parties opposite, and of course in our budget we made sure to protect the payslips of working people through no increase in income tax, employees' national insurance or VAT. And Madam Deputy Speaker, our approach to reform strikes the right balance between providing significant tax relief for family farms and fixing the public finances in a fair way. And as such, I commend the government's amendment to the motion before us today.
The original question was, as on the order paper, since when an amendment has been proposed, as on the order paper, the question is that the original words stand part of the question. Now the debate will continue, and I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Tim Farron.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's my utter privilege to speak on behalf of my party, on behalf of our farmers, and on behalf of 1,500 farmers in Westmoreland and Lonsdale. I represent people all the way from the Yorkshire Dales and the North Pennines, right the way through the Lake District and to the Cartmel Peninsula. And we're not just proud of our farmers because they feed us and because they care for our environment, but because they are the stewards of our heritage. The Lake District is a World Heritage Site, and when UNESCO awarded us World Heritage Site status, they did so giving as much credit to the farmers as they did to the glaciers that had formed for the formation of the landscapes which we live amongst, which drives a tourism economy with more than 20 million visitors a year. So we seriously value our farmers, and our farmers need to hear that, because the tone of debate, not just today, but over the last few months, has been that politicians do not value farmers. But words are cheap. Words are, that's early on, but go for it. Yeah, go on.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and I have no doubt of his personal commitment on this. But doesn't his party have a credibility problem that, for all the rhetoric in this chamber and outside, when they actually get their hands on power in local governments such as in Oxfordshire, they brutally attack their farmers by banning all meat and dairy?
Well, I mean, this is nonsense. Wherever Liberal Democrats are in control, we back and support our farmers and are proud to do so. But talk is cheap, and most people in this House will sometimes utter the phrase, and they're right to utter it, that British farmers are the best in the world, without actually understanding why. It's true, they are. They really are. British farmers are the best in the world, and there's a reason why, and that is because the way in which our farming economy is structured is that it's based upon the family farm. And the family farm makes a difference because you have close husbandry, because you have higher environmental standards, higher welfare standards, better quality produce. It is not an accident that British farming is the best in the world. I will give way.
Does he think that the difficulty the Labour Party have got in all this is they just don't understand farmers, and they don't fit neatly into this clumsy definition of what a working person is? These are people who work 12 hours per day outside the toughest environment, who work into their old age, but they do not get into the Labour club.
There is something in that, and I'll come to that in a moment, about poverty in our countryside, and it just doesn't look the way that people often in urban communities think it ought to look. There is no doubt, though, that family farms are under attack, but this did not start on the 4th of July, and I want to just go through why we ended up the way we are now. The botched transition from the old farm payment scheme to the new one is the principal source of hardship amongst our farmers. Let's just start with the very fact that there was, as we mentioned already, a £350 million underspend of the Elms budget under the last government, and it wasn't an accident. It was blindingly obvious that this was going to happen. I'll quote you one hill farmer I spoke to just last month who told me that he will lose, as a consequence of the transition, £40,000 a year in basic payment. He will gain, to replace it, 14,000 in SFI to replace it. By the way, it cost him 6,000 to get in the first place, to go through a land agent. Let me make a little bit of progress. Well, no, go on. I will let him. I'll let him, and then we'll. Yeah.
Profoundly important point, and not for the first time he's speaking as a Liberal Democrat, but also in a way that belies the fact that he's a Liberal Democrat, because he is genuinely committed to the countryside. Now, the honourable gentleman has made a point about family farms. The important thing about family farms is not only the arguments that he's already advanced, but also the sense that they represent a continuum, an investment for the future. The reason this policy is so detrimental is because, of course, it impacts on that sense that farmers are investing now for generations to come.
And I'm going to get there, but he will have to tolerate me pinning accurately blame on his side before I get over there. So let's just ask ourselves this question. We were told by the last government at the beginning that they would maintain the proportion of the amount of funding that we used to spend when we were in the European Union. In England, that was £2.4 billion. In one sense, and one sense only, they kind of kept that promise, because it was £2.4 billion throughout that 5 5 years. Brackets, they didn't spend it. They didn't spend it because they phased out the old scheme very, very rapidly, very quickly, a great hardship, particularly to small family farms, but they brought in the new schemes far too slowly and made it very difficult for people to get into it. And by the way, the people who weren't able to get into the new schemes are the big farmers. They were the ones, the landowners, people who had the land agents to enable them. I'll not give way for the moment. The land agents to help them to get into the schemes. The large landowners, the big estates, they managed to get into those schemes. They're all right, broadly speaking. The smaller family farms, farmers who own their own farms and tenants are the ones who have struggled. It's also worth bearing in mind there's been a little bit of inflation since 2019. The cost of running a farm when it comes to feed, when it comes to energy, when it comes to fuel, all sorts of input costs have gone through the roof. So the fact that we're just at 2.4 billion now, as we were 5 and a bit years ago, is absolutely nonsense. It's important also to recognise that the grants that were available under the last government and now so often are only available in reality to those who've got the cash flow to be able to get them in the first place. I will give way. Yeah.
Madam Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for giving way. If land prices were to go down, as has been described by the Minister, which I'm not sure I do believe, but if they were, and you were heavily borrowed from the bank might look at the value of your asset and could possibly call in the loan, which would put farmers out of business right away.
I've heard that from land agents in my own constituency, and my honourable friend makes a really interesting point. We obviously don't know what will happen unless and until it happens, but one potential is that is exactly what does happen, in which case there's no money to invest in businesses, and people will end up not being able to pay back their loans, and also the government won't make anything like the amount of money that it thinks it's going to. So whatever the outcome, it is bad news for farmers and actually also for the Exchequer. It's also just worth bearing in mind that where that money that the last government spent has gone, and it has gone on landscape recovery and other schemes mostly taken up by very, very, very large estates where either smaller farmers have got nothing or tenant farmers have had to do just exactly what they are told. And we have seen something in my part of the world of a Lakeland clearances over the last 3 or 4 years as a result of all this. So let us not forget that pre the 4th of July, the farming economy was under enormous threat and enormous danger because of either accident or design, but the failure of the previous government, and they need to take that on the chin. I will give way.
Thank you. I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. He mentions about tenant farmers, and I know that he'll have some like I do in my constituency of Shipley. I think nationwide, a third of all farmland is managed by tenant farmers. Last month, the department announced the appointment of a new commissioner for the tenant farming sector in England, which I hope that my right honourable friend will welcome. Can he also agree with me that the last government will continue to be much more operating in the interests of large landowners rather than tenant farmers?
So I think that, she makes a very good reference to the outcome of the Rock Review, which took place under the last government. The last government took too long to put those things into practice. I am pleased that this government has said that they will implement the recommendations of the Rock Review. Baroness Rock, by the way, deserves enormous thanks and praise from all of us for her work defending tenant farmers. But it's also and that she's not been replaced is very regrettable. My concern is, because of what we are talking about today, the farming and the inheritance tax issue and the consequences of that, it would have made so much more sense, given the impact on tenants, if the Commissioner and their framework was in place before this policy was brought into practice. It feels like putting it the wrong way around. Now, I'm going to seek to crack on and not take any more interventions now, because I've already taken up, with help from friends on either side, 9 minutes of this place's time. But just a final run through, just some of the consequences of the terrible failure of the Conservative government when it came to farming in the last 5 years. In the last 5 years alone, Madam Deputy Speaker, livestock farm incomes have dropped by 41% in 5 years. In 5 years, year on year, a drop in sheep numbers of over 4%. 6% annual drop in the number of dairy farms. We lost 440 dairy farms last year alone. So that's where we are, and that's before we get into trade deals, the attack on rural services, healthcare, dentistry, and I am going to very quickly make a reference to Brexit, because without a doubt, the impact of us leaving the European Union and having the terrible deal that they signed up to us to has had the biggest of all impacts on agriculture. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, you'd think the new Labour government had a massive open goal in front of them, given what they inherited from the other side. Massive open goal, no goalkeeper between the posts, and somehow the ball ended up in row Z. I find it almost impossible to countenance how they've managed to fluff that opportunity. The family farm tax, I want to just talk about two people who gave me really useful insight in the last couple of days, both from my constituency. Both of them gave me 4 separate case studies. The first was a land advisor who talked to me about, again, 4 farms. Their story was about shrinking business as a result of the family farm tax, about the ability, and indeed the reduction in the value of land potentially, which means that they wouldn't be able to invest in their businesses, and secondly, there wouldn't be the tax yield that the government is banking on. And then another who was a local accountant who gave me 4 anonymised case studies of local family farms in my communities. And of those family farms, only one of them was earning above the minimum wage. 3 of them significantly below the minimum wage. In those 4 particular cases, 2 would have to sell off parts of the farm to pay the inheritance tax, and 2 would have to sell the entire farm altogether. And the next question is, who will those farms be sold to? We heard from a member opposite a moment or two ago about the proportion of farmland being sold into private hands, into private equity and so on. Well, it'll go into those hands even more, as if the neighbouring farm is going to buy that land off them when they're in the same predicament themselves. So what we're seeing is hard-working farmers on less than the minimum wage having to sell off their land to private equity. Is that a very Labour thing to do? By the honourable member behind talks about Labour not getting the working class in the countryside. Perfect example. It's not too late for them to learn. And I would just say that yes, happy to give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. It seems clear that just like the winter fuel allowance changes, the government have missed their target here, and as my honourable friend rightly says, it seems obvious large landowners will have the ways and means to avoid this tax. Does my honourable friend agree with me that there should be some form of working farm test?
Yes, I mean, those are the things that the government should have been thinking about. We heard from the Minister that lots of planning and diligence had gone into this before it came out of the Chancellor's mouth on Budget Day. It doesn't feel like it, because there's a whole range of issues like that that could have been considered in advance. I want to just move on from the inheritance tax issue to another matter, which I think will do more immediate harm to farming even than the inheritance tax changes, and that's the government's decision to summarily reduce basic payments by 76% in one single year. This will have a direct impact in particular on tenant farmers who are relying upon that money, who will end up missing their rental payments. We will see evictions as a consequence of it. It's also worth bearing in mind that the government's trumpeted $5 billion over 2 years. My basic maths tells me that's $2.5 billion a year. The $2.5 billion a year, I'm careful or nervous about making confident predictions anywhere, particularly in this place, but my confident prediction is they won't spend that budget. If you cut basic payment by 76% and you haven't got the new schemes up and running to replace them ready yet, you're not going to spend that amount of money, and this government will end up in the same mess the last one did by underspending. Yeah.
Huge respect for the gentleman opposite, who's also my neighbouring MP, but I do have a question. There was a suggestion from his backbench a moment ago for a working farm tax, and it wasn't clear to me whether he accepted or rejected that suggestion. And also, we've heard Liberal Democrats from those benches in recent weeks talking about land taxes and wealth taxes as alternatives to raise the revenue to fund the many spending commitments that his party has made. I just wonder if he would clarify the point on those.
My honourable friend, so I thank my honourable neighbour for his point, and to clarify my response to my honourable friend from North Cornwall, could the government have looked at a working farm qualification exemption so those people would never have to pay this, and that you would potentially look, who knows, at allowing those people who are not active farmers for them to be under the HMRC microscope instead, and that would be something which would be far preferable to what we have got. Let's just look at the issue about grant payments, which I think is really significant. We've talked about, I absolutely am of the view then that with the cut in basic payments and the failure of the government to be on message and as quick as they should be when it comes to the new payments. We're going to see an underspend from this government as well as we did for the last one. I'm pretty confident of that. But we've seen in recent days the government's decisions to pause capital grant payments, which is going to be a huge blow to our farmers. The kind of areas that will end up being cut or paused are issues to do with hedging, walling, fencing, countryside stewardship grants to allow nature-friendly farming, work to prevent pollution of waterways, slurry storage, covered yards to clean up our rivers, peatland restoration, storing carbon and being the cornerstones of natural flood management. Matthew, one of my constituents who farms in the Eden Valley, explained yesterday that he had just finished installing 10,000 metres of fencing for a nature-friendly farming project. The pause in the grant funding means that he will not be able to buy any hedge plants to finish the work, nor will he get the mid-tier countryside stewardship annual payment. He says some say it could be paused until June. This is a business-breaking issue. On top of that, just very briefly, the higher level schemes payment have not increased since I entered this house in 2005. £40 per hectare for moorland restoration in 2005, £40 per hectare today. It's a brutal attack on hill farmers and those who farm in our common land. Again, some of the SFI options on common land are good, and to be rewarded for doing more for nature is a good thing, but currently the SFI moorland options are closed to all common land because of technical issues online. So we can see those consequences very, very clearly. Look, amongst all this, farmers are struggling, often with their mental health. The isolation you feel when you are farming and you have farmed a valley, let's say, for generations and your family have, and you might be the one who ends up losing the family farm is utterly, utterly devastating. And farmers do, though, just crack on with doing the job, and so our job is to be their voice. Farming is a glorious vocation. The work farmers do to protect our towns and villages from flooding, to promote biodiversity, to back the tourism economy, to tackle climate change, to be the underpinning of landscape heritage, to produce our food. And that, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the real fundamental failure of the last government and of this one. They have brought together agricultural policies that actively disincentivise the production of food. That is criminal and it is foolish. And that is the first thing Liberal Democrats will put right. A food strategy, additional £1 billion a year for ELMS to back our family farmers. It is time we listen to farmers, and it's like time we listen, and I promise I am finishing now, to listen to farmers such as Liz and Matthew Staley from near Kirby Steve and their sons, Luke and Lewis. And I talk to Liz just regularly, and she says there is so much anguish out there for farmers. On the new schemes, she says, they aren't working and there isn't the crossover yet. They're just making it harder to make a living. I want to encourage people on all sides, especially in government, to listen to Liz. It is farmers' vocation to save our planet and to feed our country. The least we can do is to give them the value and the future that they deserve.
This is already an oversubscribed debate, but to point out a simple fact, if you were not here for the opening speech from the Shadow Minister, you will not be called. That is basic etiquette. I call Mayor Ellis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I represent Ribble Valley in Lancashire, one of the most beautiful constituencies in the country and one of the most rural in terms of the number of farms on my patch. There are